So during this time, Muslims believed that Europeans were backward and even dirty. And then Europeans believed that Muslims were pagan infidels. Some considered them inhuman. So in the medieval era, there was this major xenophobia. And what's interesting is, as we've already mentioned, the Crusades in previous videos in this segment, this connection, even though they're fighting one another, opens up interest in additional trade and contact later. So, despite their views on one another, they still have a deep interest in exchanging goods. Uh, so, as Western Europeans became more open to these new ideas and as more unified political units looked towards protection and expansion of their own trade, conflict seemed inevitable. So, it was kind of this. I mean, they want each other for trade, but at the same time, as the world grows, they have trouble existing in such close proximity. So, last but not least, since this is not a European history course, I only really briefly want to touch upon the Renaissance. So, if you want more, there's a whole lot in European history curriculum, and I will eventually make videos on those when I teach AP Euro again in the future. So in the Renaissance, it's a period that's marked with expansion of trade as well as the growth of an agricultural surplus in Western Europe, and it leads to a revival of interest in learning and the arts. There's a growing middle class during this time, and they have access to money that was available to patronize craftspeople, teachers, and in the wealthy patronize the arts. The Renaissance was characterized by a revival of interest in classical Greek and Roman literature, art, civic virtue, culture. So again, as we've already talked about, it's really key then that this knowledge was preserved from the ancient era, so that you have clergy members in Western Europe who are continuing to preserve these ancient texts, and you also have Muslim scholars who are preserving them at the same time. Key Renaissance ideas are humanism, which was the revival of antiquity. Antiquity is also just classical knowledge. It focuses on individuals rather than God. So there's also a secular component to it. And humanism focused on education and reform. So, for example, there were handbooks of behavior that came out during this time, so the 15th, 16th century. People began to consider not only their place in heaven, but also their place in the world. And that's a key difference from medieval thinking, which was much more religious, much less focused on the current life, much more focused on the afterlife. Cultural changes during the Renaissance, such as the increased use of vernacular language, propelled the rise of powerful monarchies, the centralization of government, and the birth of nationalism. So lots of idea changes during the Renaissance. It's a major shift in just the way people lived. There were, just for simplicity's sake, we focus on the Renaissance in two geographic areas, the Southern or the Italian Renaissance, and then the Renaissance in Northern Europe. So the Italian Renaissance flourished in the city-states of Italy and Spain. The focus, when I say the Italian Renaissance, I also just mean the Southern, the more Catholic, eventually Renaissance. The focus is still very clearly under the church. The church acts as one of the major patrons to the arts. In other words, they were funding art projects. Artists couldn't afford to make these things otherwise, so they needed to have people to fund them. So what's interesting is if we go way back, even to the medieval era, we already start to see that there are some texts that have a religious framework, but at the same time are starting to embody these more inquisitive ideas of the Renaissance. So if we go way back to the 13th century and look at the works of Dante in the Divine Comedy, he is definitely very religious in the way that he writes, because he features hell, purgatory, and heaven. But despite this, you can still see the inquiring spirit of the Renaissance, because Dante is definitely clear about his reverence for pagan writers. He very obviously criticizes the corruption in the church, And even more importantly, Dante writes the Divine Comedy in Italian instead of Latin. So that's a big change from the medieval era. Renaissance popes acted as patrons of famous artists for the Renaissance quite frequently. So many of the most important sculptures and paintings from the Southern Renaissance have religious subjects. And as the Renaissance in the South continued until the 16th century, you still see a close connection with the church, even though secular thought grew. So I just wanted to draw your attention to why these pieces of art could be both secular and religious at the same time. The one in the middle, in particular, has to a certain extent still a religious bent because it is a marriage, which is clearly a sacrament. But at the same time, this focus on symmetry, this focal point, and also just emphasizing a very Greco-Roman structure in the background is something that is also secular, something that has Renaissance ideas. These two are much more secular in nature. Of course, the Mona Lisa is focused on a non-religious figure and arguably is much more focused on individualism, humanism, because it's focusing on the details of her face. Religious art was much less detailed in terms of facial structure. And also, you can see the same attention to humanism and individualism in the detail in which Da Vinci sketches the human body. The Renaissance in the North was a little bit different. By about 1400, the Renaissance spirit had spread to Northern Europe. So when I say Northern Europe, I really mean the Netherlands, the Baltic Sea coast, England, France. So there's a much greater emphasis on piety among even the lay people. And when I say the lay people or the laity, I just mean people who are not members of the clergy. And at the same time, there was an increasing interest in understanding the physical world. So Geoffrey Chaucer, who was from England, when he wrote the Canterbury Tales in the late 14th century, he was really portraying a microcosm of middle-class occupations in England, including several church positions. So his social satire of monks who loved hunting and overly sentimental nuns provided an example of humanism in that Chaucer was focusing on worldly secular life, but he was still acknowledging the importance of the church and the occupations connected with it. So just like Dante in his Divine Comedy, which we just talked about, Chaucer wrote in the vernacular. He wrote in Middle English, but many of Chaucer's other writings were in Latin. But still, the Canterbury Tales is a good example to use, showing that change, even really early on before the Renaissance really catches on in Northern Europe. In terms of politics, you start to see the development of newly centralized monarchies in England and France during the Renaissance time, which is a key difference. So you can think of people like Henry VIII in England, or you could also, of course, think about Elizabeth afterward, Queen Elizabeth. And then you could think about someone like Henry of Navarre or all of the Louis, of course, in France as a good example of more centralization of monarchies. And of course, eventually that leads to absolutism in these places. In terms of art, it differed from the more religious and classical art of Italy. It still had religious themes, of course. If you think about Van Eyck's famous painting here, there's clearly a religious idea because this is a married couple. They are definitely engaging in that sacrament. At the same time, it's still focusing on its lay people, right? It is not members of the clergy. And there's quite a bit of attention to their facial features and just the general detail of the painting, which is less religious in nature. It very more frequently reflected middle-class occupations and peasant celebrations, just in terms of Renaissance art in the North. In terms of writing, one of the most famous Renaissance Northern writers that I would mention would be Erasmus, who was Dutch, and his most famous book was In Praise of Folly. Dutch humanist of the late 15th century. And Erasmus is still deeply religious, although he is a humanist thinker, and a good friend of Henry VIII, I might add. Nicholas Copernicus shows you a good example of the connection between Renaissance thinking and, of course, the scientific revolution. Copernicus was from Poland, and his work in particular on the revolution of the heavenly spheres, which ultimately leads to heliocentricity, or the idea that the sun is the center of the earth, not the earth, as Aristotle had once said. His work shows increasing interest in understanding the physical world, which was an interest that sometimes led to conflict with the Catholic Church. And we will continue to talk about that new scientific thinking and, of course, other continued elements of knowledge when we talk about industrialization in period 4. But that's it for this segment, finally, in medieval Europe. Lots of videos for this segment, but hope they help you with preparing for the AP exam. Thanks, as always. We'll continue with the Mongols soon, so stay tuned for that, and thanks.